On a stormy night in September 1979, the world learned of an eerie mystery. Five young women members of the St. Mary of Peace convent in small-town Havenwood vanished without a trace. For decades, their disappearance was written off as a tragic accident, or worse yet, a scandalous elopement. But behind the whispered rumors and the neatly folded newspaper clippings lay a far darker truth. These sisters had fled a place that was supposed to shelter them, a place they had trusted with their very souls. To understand why their story went unspoken for so long, we need to look beyond Havenwood to the larger pattern of silence and cover-ups that has haunted the Catholic Church in America. You've probably heard of the Boston Globe's Spotlight team in 2002, a tight-knit group of investigative reporters cracked open decades of abuse in the Archdiocese of Boston. Those landmark articles didn't just expose individual priests who preyed on children. They revealed an institutional machinery that shuffled offending clergy from parish to parish, burying complaints in dusty files so the church's reputation would remain untarnished. Survivors found themselves powerless, their voices stifled by the same hierarchy that was supposed to protect them. Just a few years ago, another seismic revelation shook Pennsylvania. A grand jury report released in 2018 documented over 1,000 victims of clerical abuse across 6 dioceses. In county courtrooms, survivors who had waited decades for justice watched as attorneys laid bare internal memos, letters, and emails detailing how bishops covered up the crimes, moving predators, silencing whistleblowers, and in one heartbreaking case, dismissing a nun's plea for help as imagination run wild. That report taught us that when power goes unchecked, the vulnerable pay the highest price. Havenwood's convent was not part of a sprawling archdiocese. It was home to just 5 nuns, led by a kindly, strict Mother Superior Agnes, whose compassion was as legendary as her discipline. When Father Michael arrived on the scene, handsome, imposing with a voice that rolled through the chapel like thunder, everyone in town thought they'd been blessed by a saint. He officiated Sunday Mass, organized charity drives, handed out rosaries during confirmation. But behind that holy exterior, he was weaving a darkness that no one could see until it was too late. What made Havenwood's story so heartbreaking and so shockingly familiar was how easily Father Michael exploited a broken system. Whenever a sister expressed discomfort, an offhand comment about an overly personal question in confession, a lingering touch that felt like a violation, she was met with gentle rebukes. You must pray more, or trust in God's will. Mother Agnes fell gravely ill at the worst possible moment, and with her protective presence gone, the convent was left vulnerable. Mother Superior's quiet inquiries met with meek excuses. Complaints were passed upward, only to disappear. This tendency to protect the institution at all costs has deep roots. For centuries, the Church has wielded its spiritual authority to command respect, and its earthly hierarchy to insulate itself from scandal. When a brave nun or a frightened parishioner came forward, the response was rarely accountability. More often, it was a transfer to another diocese, another parish where new faithful faces would greet the priest unexposed, unchallenged, and with every opportunity to offend again. By the time Sister Grace and her 4 companions realized that no one in the official chain of command would act on their evidence, the harm had already been done. The convent walls that once promised sanctuary had become barriers to justice. No human hand would rip them down, so the nuns did it themselves. In the dead of night, under wind-blown rain, they climbed over the stone parapets, leaving behind sacred habits and fractured dreams. They emerged as fugitives rather than victims, forced into anonymity simply to survive. Their flight was the only escape hatch the system allowed them. But if Boston and Pennsylvania taught us anything, it's that running doesn't always mean safety, and staying silent only emboldens abusers. In the decades that followed, thousands of survivors discovered community in their shared pain and triumph. Grassroots organizations like SNAP, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, emerged, giving survivors a platform and the legal guidance to pursue justice, even when statutes of limitations had run dry. Podcasts like Priests Behaving Badly and documentaries sparked conversation from kitchen tables to Senate hearings, reminding us that no institution is above accountability. Today, many states have extended or eliminated the statute of limitations for childhood sexual abuse, acknowledging that survivors need time to heal before they can confront their abusers in court. In New York, for example, legislation passed in 2019 opens a look-back window allowing anyone abused as a minor to file suit until their 55th birthday. Other states have followed suit, chipping away at the legal barriers that once protected predators. The Sisters of Havenwood may not have had that kind of legal recourse in 1979, but their story, once hidden, is now part of a larger tapestry of courage. When Sister Grace finally spoke out decades later, she was not just telling her own tale, she was shining a light on the faults of an entire system. She brought with her the precise, heartbreaking details that had been recorded in secret dates, Time's whispered threats, filthy confessions, masquerading as penance. Her evidence sat in a bishop's desk drawer long before she fled. Her escape forced the issue into the open. In telling their story, Grace and her sisters joined a chorus that stretches from Boston to Pennsylvania, to every diocese grappling with its past. They taught us that transparency is not an optional virtue, it is a necessity. When allegations arise, they must be investigated publicly. Survivors must be supported promptly. Offending clergy must face both canonical and civil consequences. Cover-ups and quiet transfers are moral failures that allow abuse to fester in hidden corners. As Americans, we've learned that faith and accountability can go hand in hand. A house of worship must be a refuge, not a hiding place. A congregation must protect its weakest members as fiercely as it guards its reputation. And we neighbours, friends, fellow worshippers, must be willing to listen to question and to demand justice when the system fails. The night the nuns escaped the walls of St. Mary of Peace, they carried with them more than fear and sorrow. They carried hope that someday their truth would be told and their voices heard. In that hope, we find our own responsibility to remain vigilant, to support survivors, and to ensure that no institution that ever again places its image above the lives of its children. That's the lesson of Havenwood, and it is a lesson we cannot afford to forget. After the first frantic hours of our escape, the real journey began not across state lines, but inside our own minds. I often think of Sister Sarah, whose gentle smile once lit our early mornings in the garden. By the time we reached Mr. Miller's barn, that smile had become a tremor. Each time thunder rumbled through the night. She would wake with a gasp, her body convulsing as though reliving the weight of Father Michael's grip on her wrist. She refused to sleep alone. Every creak of the wooden walls felt like his footsteps hunting us down. I learned the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, years later from a therapist who worked with survivors of religious trauma. But long before that, I watched Sarah's hands shake whenever she reached for a simple cup of water. She would freeze, mid-motion tears, welling up eyes, seeing ghosts in the shadows. Joy, who had once sung catechism songs with a hearty laugh, stopped laughing at all. She raged at the slightest provocation, her anger a brittle shield against the helplessness she felt. Martha, our eldest, and our rock in the convent's kitchen became painfully quiet. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she'd trace her fingers along the chipped edge of a counter, as if seeking the old comfort of routine. I wondered if I would have fared any better. My own heart pounded so fiercely that it felt like an animal trapped in my chest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Father Michael's face in the folds of my habit, in the glow of the lantern. even after I traded it for plain clothes. I began to dread the night itself. I would lie awake, counting the seconds between raindrops, certain that each one carried his voice cajoling us to return. When we finally settled tentatively into life in Cleveland, I found the silence deafening. In the convent, our days had been filled with prayers, chores, the hushed rustle of habits over stone floors. There, the absence of ritual left an ache so deep I thought my ribs might crack. I did not cry, at least not openly, but I felt the tears gathering behind my eyes, refusing to fall. It was Sarah who spoke first one afternoon as we sat on the worn sofa in our tiny rental living room. Our clothes were simple, loose blouses, jeans that pinched at the waist. The sun through the thin curtain and glanced off her tear-streaked cheek. I had a dream, she said, voice barely above a whisper. He's there again, in the woods behind our house. I took her hand. It was just a dream. She shook her head. I know, but it felt real. That night I called the local crisis hotline number on a crumpled flyer from our church's bulletin board. The volunteer on the other end was kind and calm. She told me I wasn't alone, that what we endured was real and nobody gets over that in a week or a month. She encouraged me to find a support group for survivors of clergy abuse. I hesitated. I was ashamed. I had left the convent to survive, not to relive the horrors from the outside. But as Sarah's sleepless nights multiplied, I realized we needed more than whispered prayers. So I drove us to our first meeting, an unmarked basement room in a distant parish hall. Inside, a dozen faces looked up at us, men and women of all ages, some with crutches leaning against folding chairs, others unsteady as they found their way to a seat. A woman named Linda stood and introduced herself. She had been abused as a child by a diocesan priest, and she spoke of years spent in therapy, rebuilding a life that felt permanently broken. She did not blame God. She blamed the men who hid behind his name. When Linda finished, I raised my hand. I'm Grace, I said. I was a nun once. A hush fell over the room. I saw Nod's unfathomable empathy in strangers' eyes. And in that moment, I felt a flicker of something I thought lost belonging. We shared our stories one by one, the words bitter and horrifying and somehow liberating as they left our lips. Over the weeks that followed, I watched Sarah transform. The nightmares remained, but she learned grounding techniques, feeling the soles of her feet on the floor, naming objects in the room to anchor herself in reality. Joy found solace in art therapy, painting abstract swirls of color that she titled Freedom and Anger on alternating evenings. Martha, who had always been tactile, took up pottery. The feel of wet clay coaxed her back into the present, molding her grief into solid form on the wheel. I discovered that healing was not a single path, but a winding road with unexpected detours. Some days I felt triumphant, proud of myself for calling that hotline, for admitting I was broken. Other days, the walls seemed to press inward, and I would collapse on the kitchen floor, sobbing until exhaustion took me under. But each time I sank, someone, Sarah or a woman from the support group, offered a hand, a cup of tea, a simple "I understand." It was during one of those shared cups of chamomile that I realized how isolating silence can be. In the convent, we wore habits. Now in our civilian clothes, we were just two women in a big world. Nobody knew why my hands trembled whenever I heard a priest's voice over the radio, or why Sarah leapt out of her skin at the sound of rain. Many asked, "Why would you leave such holy work?" When I tried to answer, their eyes would gloss over with confusion or pity. So I fell silent again. But silence, I learned, only perpetuates harm. My therapist, Dr. Elena Ramos, explained that culture often demands forgiveness before a victim even begins to heal. Yet forgiveness is neither quick nor obligatory. Dr. Ramos warned that urging survivors to forgive too soon can re-traumatize them as if they had failed some moral test because they could not forget. Instead, she taught me to hold space for anger, to let it flow through me without shame. So I began to speak first to my closest friends' neighbors, who had once invited me to bake sales, now waving awkward hellos. I told them I was not the pious nun they assumed me to be, but a woman marked by years of fear. Some recoiled. A few crossed the street to avoid me. But others paused, eyes thoughtful, and eventually welcomed me more fully for my honesty. It surprised me how bravery can inspire empathy. One evening, I shared our story at a regional conference on clergy abuse. The auditorium was packed with lawyers, journalists, and survivors. I'd never been comfortable speaking in public, but as I told the tale of the convent garden where children once gathered, and where we found none of the comfort we sought, the room fell silent. When I finished, dozens rose to their feet. They applauded not just for me, but for Sarah, Joy, Martha, Eleanor, for every victim who had ever felt mute. That standing ovation felt like a promise that our pain could galvanize change. In the months after the network grew, we organized workshops in churches for mandatory reporting training. We worked with state legislators to extend the statute of limitations. We partnered with mental health clinics to offer sliding scale or free therapy for survivors. Through it all, I kept learning that true shame belongs not to those who speak out, but to those who hide behind silence. That trauma can isolate you like a high wall, but community builds ladders strong enough to scale it. And that faith, far from demanding blind obedience, can be a source of courage when you follow the faint voice inside you telling you something is wrong. Today, years after the haven of our escape, I still see reflections of that frightened nun in young women who call our center trembling, barely capable of saying the word abuse. They remind me how vital it is to listen with full attention without judgment. Because until every story is heard, every story, however painful, none of us is truly free. In the years after finding refuge in Cleveland, I carried a heavy secret in my heart, and alongside it, an uneasy question. Could we ever find true justice? Hiding under new names had kept us safe from Father Michael's reach, but the law of the land still treated our wounds as if they were part of someone else's story. That's when I began to understand the stark difference between criminal and civil paths to redress, and why, for so many survivors, the promise of justice felt forever out of reach. When I first asked a lawyer if Father Michael could face criminal charges, I was told that most states had strict statutes of limitations on sexual offenses. In Ohio, where we lived by then, prosecutors typically had only a few years after the victim turned 18 to bring charges. For crimes committed in childhood or adolescence, that deadline often lapsed before a survivor felt safe enough to speak out. I thought of Sarah, Joy, Martha, Eleanor, all gone before they had the chance to testify. Their voices, like mine, had been stifled by fear. I realized our flight in 1979 had been physically freeing, but legally we remained prisoners of time. It was during a legal clinic at a survivors' conference that I first heard of New York's bold experiment in 2019. The state opened a look-back window, giving anyone abused as a minor the right to file suit until their 55th birthday, regardless of when the abuse occurred. Suddenly, decades of silence and healing no longer meant forfeiture of justice. I saw glimmers of possibility, a way to shine a spotlight not only on Father Michael, but also on the bishops who had knowingly swept the matter under a velvet carpet. But civil suits are a different kind of trek. In the celebrated Fitzgerald versus Archdiocese of New York case, which ultimately settled for tens of millions, the plaintiff, once a seminarian, had meticulously documented his mistreatment by a priest. He spent years gathering depositions, medical records, and affidavits from fellow seminarians who corroborated his story. His courage became a roadmap. Survivors could assemble evidence, summon witnesses, and pressure institutions into accountability through financial liability. That financial risk, in turn, often forced dioceses to negotiate confidential settlements. Yet it came at a steep price: the threat of ruinous legal fees and the emotional toll of reliving trauma in a courtroom. I met Jill, a fellow survivor from Pennsylvania, whose lawsuit against her former parish had dragged on for 7 years. She spoke of endless depositions and the bitterness of discovery subpoenas that demanded she produce every diary entry and therapy note she'd ever written. I felt exposed in ways I never imagined, she told me one rainy afternoon in Hartford. The church's lawyers poked through my life like vultures. Her suit did win a sizable settlement, but the victory taste was bittersweet. She paid in anguish what she gained in dollars. Hearing Jill's story, I understood why so many survivors hesitate. Early on, Eleanor had insisted we keep Eleanor's notebook unblemished. A careful ledger of dates, times, and words we managed to record in furtive moments. Evidence is everything, she'd whispered. Never destroy what might prove us right. That simple directive became my guiding creed. When I finally decided to pursue civil action in North Carolina, where evidence could still be introduced, even if criminal prosecution was off the table, I brought that notebook with me, secure in a bank's safe deposit box. But evidence alone does not guarantee a hearing. In my first consultation with a firm in Charlotte, the attorney praised Eleanor's diligence, but warned, "We'll need expert witnesses, psychologists to explain PTSD, historians to contextualize church protocol in the 1970s. Even accident reconstructionists, if we want to show how your escape night was more than a fugitive's rash decision." The price tag for an expert roster was daunting. I nearly walked away. Then I learned of SNAP Survivors Network, of those abused by priests, an advocacy group that connected survivors, with pro bono legal counsel and scholarship funds for expert testimony. Through SNAP, I secured a psychologist who agreed to testify about trauma's impact on memory, and a retired canon lawyer willing to explain church law to a jury. Even so, the pre-trial phase was grueling. Depositions lasted full days. I sat across from a defense attorney who asked me to recount in vivid detail every moment of humiliation I'd ever endured. I trembled, but I told the truth, drawing strength from the memory of Eleanor's voice. "Speak your story. That is your power." My testimony became the backbone of our complaint, woven together with Eleanor's notes. Mr. Miller's affidavit and other scraps of evidence from the diocesan archives we pried open during our initial inquiry. Then came the most unexpected turn: the diocese offered to settle out of court. The bishop's letter arrived one afternoon, crisp and formal, citing compassion for genuine suffering and proposing a sum that would cover my legal fees and provide resources for a healing foundation in Havenwood. The offer was an implicit admission of moral responsibility, though no criminal charges would follow. It felt like progress, though it came wrapped in careful legal language designed to avoid any explicit acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I remember sitting in my modest kitchen, the settlement letter in hand, and thinking of all the nuns who had disappeared into anonymity. Would they have wanted me to accept? Or would they have urged me to push for a public trial, believing the truth deserved open daylight? I brewed tea and called Sarah, who had married and moved to Atlanta. "Take the settlement," she said after a long pause. "Use the money to fund Grace's center. Make sure no one else has to start from nothing." Joy, Martha, and Eleanor had all urged me to build that center. It was their dream in faded pencil ink at the back of Eleanor's notebook. The money meant I could hire full-time counselors and reach more survivors throughout the Southeast. Signing the settlement wasn't easy. It came with a confidentiality clause, silence again to some extent, but also a binding commitment from the diocese to fund our St. Mary's Justice Fund for 5 years. In that paradox, I found a measure of compromise, a way to turn legal liability into concrete support for victims. It wasn't a criminal conviction for Father Michael. He had died with his secrets mostly still in hand, but it was accountability. In a form the secular world recognizes, a ledger entry, a promise of ongoing funding, and the stain on public records that no bishop could scrub away. From that moment, I realized that the path to justice is rarely pure or linear. Criminal courts may close their doors on survivors whose silence once saved them. Civil courts demand evidence and expertise that can break even the bravest soul. Yet every filing, every deposition, every negotiated term chips away at the Church's impunity. It creates a paper trail that other survivors can follow, a blueprint for dismantling the legal shields institutions erect. Today, St. Mary's Justice Fund supports not only psychological care, but also legal aid for those who dare to sue. We host workshops on preserving evidence, how to keep a timeline, how to ask friends or witnesses for written statements, how to secure old letters or photographs. We teach self-advocacy in court, how to stand tall through cross-examination, how to remember that your suffering is real and worthy of redress. And in celebrating the Fitzgeralds and Jills of the world, we underline a truth I learned the hard way, that securing justice is as much a community effort as a personal crusade. Our story reminds us that laws can change when enough voices demand it. We have seen states like New Jersey and California follow New York's example, extending or even abolishing time bars for child abuse claims. We have watched media investigations prompt legislative hearings, and we have witnessed over the years a gradual cultural shift from questioning survivors' motives to believing their testimonies and protecting their rights. If there is one lesson in this winding legal journey, it is that we must never accept a system that treats survivors' silence as guilt. We must chisel open statutes of limitation, flood the archives with records, and refuse settlements that perpetuate secrecy without funding meaningful reform. Most of all, we must remind each other that the path to justice may be strewn with setbacks, but every step forward, every case filed, every boxer's bell ending, another deposition is an act of liberation. Because in the end, justice is not a destination. It is the courage to demand accountability in the face of powerful institutions and to keep telling our stories one word at a time. When the story of our escape and eventual fight for justice first surfaced, it did so not on the evening news, but in fragments. A whispered conversation at a women's retreat, a short feature in a local paper, a quiet post on a survivor's message board. Yet each of those humble beginnings carried an ember of hope, proof that community and communication could reshape even the most entrenched systems. I remember the first time I realized our voices could carry further than a cramped parish hall. A reporter from a small independent magazine called me after reading an online account of my deposition. She wanted to know how did it feel after 30 years in hiding to finally speak out. I spent an hour on the phone with her describing the tremor in my stomach as I lifted that tattered notebook of Eleanor's in open court, the relief of sharing our true names and the strange pride I felt when strangers stood and applauded my story. She ran a 3-page spread with photos of our convent garden, now overgrown but still ringed by stone walls. When I saw it in print, I clutched the magazine to my chest, feeling as though someone had handed me a megaphone. Soon after, a producer from a popular true crime podcast reached out. They wanted to weave our tale into an episode alongside other stories of clergy abuse. I hesitated. In the convent, I had been defined by silence. I worried that speaking into millions of earbuds would dash my hard-won sense of safety. But when Sarah urged me on, saying, "They'll listen when they know it's real," I agreed. The recording session took place in a tiny studio in Atlanta. As I sat before the microphone, I looked into the muted red on air light and thought of Eleanor's challenge. Your voice is stronger than you imagine. So I spoke hesitant at first. Then, with growing conviction, the episode dropped on a Tuesday morning. That afternoon, my inbox flooded with messages, survivors, thanking me, journalists, requesting interviews, and even a few clergymen expressing shame and regret. A retired priest from Wisconsin wrote to say he had confronted his own diocese about past cover-ups after listening to our story. He called it a reckoning I couldn't ignore. In that moment, I saw how stories build bridges across miles and denominations, how the mere act of sharing can spark accountability. Not long after, a grassroots group called Faithful Watch invited me to a town hall-style forum in Philadelphia. The room was packed: activists, lawyers, survivors, reporters, local parishioners. They set up a projector and played clips of our podcast, then opened the floor. Hands shot up, each person with a personal pain to voice or a question about how to prevent future abuse. One woman recounted how as a teenager she'd tried to tell her parish council about her experience, but was told to be grateful for your calling. A teacher spoke of her students' fear of confession and how she'd disrupted the practice for sixth graders until proper oversight was instituted. Lawyers offered to draft model policies for mandatory reporting. By the end of the evening, the group had formed a task force to liaise with local dioceses. That task force became a template. In county seats across the country, small teams, often just 3 or 4 volunteers, began organizing church accountability circles. They met in community centers, public libraries, even coffee shops. Each circle adopted a simple creed: we will listen, we will advocate, we will educate. They held training sessions on bystander intervention, how to recognize the early warning signs of grooming, how to document suspicious behavior, and how to approach church leadership with evidence. They created hotlines staffed by volunteers with crisis counseling backgrounds that any parishioner could call if they felt unsafe. In Havenwood itself, change was perhaps slowest but most profound. The small town that once whispered about the missing nuns now hosted quarterly public forums in the former parish hall. These gatherings drew civic leaders, clergy, and families. One memorable forum featured former parishioners sharing the rumors they'd ignored: how Father Michael had complimented the choir girls a little too often, how he'd claimed to help troubled novices after lights out. Those revelations stung, but they also released pain that had festered under polite silence. When I stood to speak, I told them, "You had the power to ask questions. You chose not to. Now it's time to make amends." Local newspapers began printing transparent accounts of new allegations, complete with the diocese's responses. In the Wood Gazette, the headline on one May morning read, "From shadows to spotlight, Havenwood confronts its past." Underneath, an op-ed praised the work of Faithful Watch, the podcast host, who'd amplified our story, and the church council that had finally instituted background checks for all volunteers. I wept reading it because I recognized in those lines the healing power of collective action. Social media, too, played its part. On Twitter, the hashtag Havenwood Voices trended briefly as survivors and allies shared photos of their own broken walls, brick fences, crumbling gates, even the rusted stirrups of an old convent carriage. Each post carried a short testimony. I spoke up, and my diocese listened. My neighbor helped me tell my story. We're building safe spaces together. A simple tweet, underlined by a few poignant words, could enkindle a local movement halfway across the country. I also discovered the influence of faith leaders who dared to dissent. A bishop in California, moved by our story, issued a public apology and pledged $5 million towards survivor-funded clinics. A chaplain at a military base read a sermon on holy courage and invited victims within his ranks to seek help. Those actions, though not directly linked to our case, were sparked by the same energy, the conviction that silence is complicit and that faith demands justice. Meanwhile, investigations arising from public pressure uncovered new documents in diocesan archives. In Denver, activists unearthed letters from 1965 in which a parish council warned bishops about a particular priest's inappropriate interest in minors. The council's recommendation for reassignment went unheeded. In Boston, the Archdiocese released thousands of pages of previously sealed records, revealing how files were mislabeled, complaints buried under personnel matters, and victims branded as troublemakers. All these developments underscored a crucial truth. Institutions shift not only from within, but from without. When communities rise up, when reporters refuse to turn away, when survivors find the courage to tell their stories. Through it all, I realized that the technical power of media print digital broadcast only amplifies what has already taken root in people's hearts. The first spark may come from a single voice, but the flame grows when many hands join in lighting the wick. Today, St. Mary's Center hosts an annual Voices of Havenwood conference in Philadelphia, bringing together survivors, clergy allies, attorneys, journalists, and everyday neighbors. We share best practices, role-play difficult conversations with church leaders, and plan new campaigns against silence. We celebrate small victories, like a diocese that hired an outside child safety auditor, and we mourn the losses that remind us why vigilance is never optional. In a world that sometimes feels toiling under the weight of unseen abuses, it is community and communication that lighten the burden. When neighbors refuse to look away, when journalists press for transparency, and when survivors support one another, the fortified walls of secrecy begin to crumble. That is the power of public witness. It transforms shame into solidarity, fear into resolve, and silence into song. So when you hear our story of Sister Grace and her 4 companions scaling that convent wall, remember that we did not scale it alone. Behind us was the steady beat of thousands of hearts, willing to listen, to share, and to stand. Each forum attended, each article published, each hashtag posted was a brick removed from the cruelty of silence. And with every brick gone, a path opened for survivors who will come after us to step forward, to speak out, and to know that they are never, ever alone. In the years after our lawsuit and the media storm it sparked, I often found myself reflecting on a simple truth. Healing is not a destination, but a lifelong journey. For survivors of clergy abuse and for communities seeking to prevent it, there is no finish line. That realization led me to transform the modest sewing shop I'd opened in North Carolina into something far more ambitious, the St. Mary's Center for Healing and Reform. What began as a few folding chairs and donated Bibles in my living room has grown into a beacon of hope and a model for lasting change. When I first spoke with Emily and Sarah about the idea, they were skeptical. "We're not counselors," Emily reminded me gently. "We're just ordinary women." But I saw in their eyes the same fire that had driven the 5 sisters to climb over that convent wall so many years ago. Together, we sketched out a plan: offer trauma-informed counseling, legal advocacy, and community education under one roof. We would hire licensed therapists, partner with pro bono attorneys, and train local volunteers to run workshops on safe environments. Most importantly, we would build a space where survivors never felt alone. Our first step was to secure funding. The settlement from the diocese provided seed money, but running a center requires far more. I still remember the day we received a call from the Cardinal's Relief Fund, an independent nonprofit funded by willing parishes that offered a 3-year grant to open a satellite office in Pennsylvania. I burst into tears when I told Sarah. "This means we can bring counselors closer to victims in Havenwood," she said, voice trembling. We can be the safe place we once lacked. That grant wasn't just financial support. It was a profound gesture of redemption from parts of the church willing to acknowledge past failures. With funding in place, we faced our first real test, designing programs that addressed the complex needs of survivors. In our initial community survey, many respondents spoke of fragmented services, a therapist with no legal knowledge, a lawyer with no understanding of trauma. We needed an integrated approach. So, we launched the Whole Person Pathway, a coordinated case plan, where each client receives a personalized blend of services, weekly therapies, legal consultations, vocational training, and peer support circles. Clients refer to it as their roadmap to reclaiming life. One of our earliest clients under this model was Maria, a former nun who'd escaped a convent in rural Florida in the 1980s. She arrived at our door with a worn suitcase and a stack of yellowed letters, the only proof she had of her abuse. In her first counseling session, she wept as she described decades of shame and self-blame. Together, we arranged for a pro bono attorney to digitize her letters, prepare affidavits from other former sisters, and file a civil suit against the diocese. Meanwhile, our vocational coach helped her enroll in a computer skills program so she could gain independence. 6 months later, Maria won a confidential settlement, used part of it to start a small home-based baking business, and joined our staff as a peer mentor. Watching her reclaim her voice was one of the greatest privileges of this work. As we celebrated individual triumphs, we also recognized the need for preventive measures. Survivors of past abuse are critical witnesses, but our mission extended beyond reactive services. We had to stop the next abuse before it began. We built a Safe Spaces initiative, offering training and certification to schools, churches, and community organizations. Our curriculum combines real-life scenarios, like an overzealous volunteer asking children to pray alone, with clear policies on background checks and reporting protocols. Participants role-play conversations where a compassionate bystander confronts a boundary violation. I noticed you coaching junior choir by yourself. Could we have 2 adults present from now on? We teach that small, respectful interventions can break the secrecy that abusers depend on. Mistakes, of course, have marked our journey. In the first year, we underestimated the complexity of working with youth. A well-meaning volunteer led a workshop for teenage survivors without adequate training in trauma triggers. A participant became overwhelmed, and we realized we needed tighter credential checks. That error taught us an invaluable lesson. Safe spaces require not just good intentions, but rigorous standards. Now every volunteer completes a 6-week certification, including supervised practicum hours and ongoing supervision by licensed clinicians. Another challenge came when a prominent local parish sponsored our work, but balked at our demand for anonymous reporting hotlines. Their rector worried it would sow distrust. We compromised by offering both anonymous and confidential routes, enabling reporters who feared retaliation to speak up, while allowing others to seek direct pastoral support. Attendance at our workshops spiked afterward, as people realized our commitment was to accountability first, not institutional comfort. Meanwhile, we've continued to advocate for policy reform at the state and national levels. In North Carolina, our center joined a coalition that successfully lobbied for mandatory reporter laws to include all volunteers at faith-based organizations, closing a loophole that had excluded many small missions and youth groups. We partnered with families whose children had no legal recourse when their complaints were disregarded during summer camps. Our lobbyists drafted model legislation that was adopted with bipartisan support. When the governor signed the bill, we filled our office with balloons and shared cake with every staff member. Proof that determined advocacy can reshape laws. Each year, we host a healing summit at a local retreat center, inviting survivors, clergy, allies, legislators, and service providers to share best practices. One breakout session featured a panel of former convent workers who walked attendees through historical patterns of clerical transfers, how allegations were silenced by bureaucracy. Their first-hand accounts spurred a diocesan representative to pledge quarterly public reports on clergy misconduct investigations, a level of transparency unheard of a decade ago. Our centre's impact stretches into education too. We created a clergy accountability curriculum for seminaries now used in 3 diocesan training programs. It includes modules on understanding grooming behaviors, upholding boundaries in pastoral care, and working with survivors in a way that centers their dignity. Some seminaries adopted live case studies from our files, redacted of course, to challenge future priests to confront the real-life consequences of silence. Perhaps my proudest moment came when a group of 5 seminarians visited us on a class assignment. They entered the building in their black cassocks, a picture of traditional faith, and left hours later with tears in their eyes, promising to carry these lessons into their ministries. When they knelt before me in the lobby and asked my blessing, I felt a profound sense of reconciliation. Faith, once the source of my deepest pain, could be reborn as a force for protection and justice. Yet throughout all these programs and policies, our guiding principle remains the same: center survivors agency. Every service we offer, every reform we champion, is shaped by those who've endured abuse. We've adopted a co-directorship model where survivors hold half of the leadership seats. That structure ensures that decisions down to the shade of paint on our walls reflect the voices of people who know the stakes personally. Looking ahead, we're working on a nationwide network of satellite centers, each modeled on our integrated approach. We've begun consultations with advocates in California, Texas, and Massachusetts, adapting our whole-person pathway to local legal and cultural contexts. We're also exploring a digital platform, a secure app, where survivors can find resources, report violations, or connect with peer support in real time. If successful, it could become the first unified portal for faith-based abuse recovery in the country. Through it all, I've held on to something Eleanor once wrote in her notebook. Silence protects the oppressor, never the oppressed. Our center stands as living proof that breaking silence, though painful, is the wellspring of transformation. From a desperate escape in a rain-soaked night to the quiet triumph of a recovered voice, our journey demonstrates how forgiveness, justice, and community can intertwine to forge lasting reform. To every survivor who reads this and wonders if there is hope, know that your story matters. To every organization intimidated by the prospect of transparency, understand that openness builds trust, not weakness. And to every faith leader who still clings to secrecy, remember that true sanctuary is built on safety, not silence. St. Mary's Centre is more than a building with offices and therapy rooms. It is a testament to resilience, the idea that broken walls can become gates of possibility, that wounded hearts can chart paths to healing, and that a community determined to do better can transform institutions from within and without. In the end, our mission is simple: to ensure that no one ever has to climb over walls of fear again, but instead can walk through doors of compassion, justice, and renewed faith.